Time. So, good afternoon. We are going to start this review session. We're going to go through Unit 3, Chapter 17 to 19. And as you can see, I've got the essential questions, the study guide projected up here on the board. So basically, we're going to go through these questions and we're going to try to just pull out a few basic facts about each of them. So, obviously, if you got a pencil, write stuff down, jot down notes, or just memorize it if you're that kind of person. So, excuse me, I think I'm the star of this show. Thank you. So, let's start with chapter 17. So remember, chapter 17 and 18 together talk about the expansion of Europe. So this is basically this time in European history after the 30 Years' War and after the Little Ice Age. So starting in the 1650s, when Europe is starting to expand again. Internally, it's going to be a more productive and economically dynamic society. And externally, you're going to see Europe expanding and establishing more control in America and some parts of Asia that start also kind of feeding its prosperity back in Europe. So let's just look at chapter 17. So number one, for expansion internally, like population growth and economic growth, number one, what were the traditional obstacles to population growth prior to the late 17th century in Europe? So, number one, you have a situation where there just isn't really enough high-tech farming going on yet to really produce a lot of food very efficiently. People are still sort of using traditional agricultural methods held over from the Middle Ages, traditional forms of crop rotation, and the open field system where peasants would just kind of be left to like grow crops as they saw fit, and then some of it would go to their landlord as rent, and the rest they would get to keep. But there wasn't really a lot of like devoted effort to maximizing the potential and profitability of agriculture across Europe. So that meant that there wasn't really enough of a surplus being produced to stimulate enormous population growth. So, now number two, what were the causes, methods, and effects of the agricultural revolution of the Netherlands and England, and the changes that occurred in rural life as a result? So in the Netherlands and England, these are two places that were centers of the scientific revolution, and as a result, engineers and scientists over the course of a century or two, through tinkering with new types of machinery and experimentation with new types of crop rotation, new types of fertilizer additives, they were able to figure out ways to maximize the number of calories per acre that they were growing. In the Netherlands, they learned how to drain swamps to open up new farmland. They built systems of dikes and levees that allowed them to drain places below sea level to open up new farmland. And those techniques were imported to England. And in addition to that, you have new technology being used to make agriculture more efficient. So things like the seed drill. You have new crops entering Europe from overseas. So things like potatoes and corn, which in parts of England especially, and Ireland, Scotland, like very sort of far northern areas, things like potatoes become incredibly productive crops. But you also have intentional commercialization of agriculture. So landowners who are saying, you know what, I'm not just going to like leave it up to the peasants to figure out how to farm this place. I want to sell these crops for profit. I want to make money from my land. So I'm going to enclose the land, the process of enclosure, and then hire peasants as laborers for cash, and basically just make them use the newest techniques in order to make sure that I can produce as much food as possible and maximize my population growth, or maximize my profitability from these lands. Now, once that starts to happen, though, food production skyrockets in the Low Countries and in England. The population starts to grow as a result and become more secure because you have the ability of England and the Netherlands to feed itself more than enough. You have a big enough surplus that there's less chance of famine, less chance of crop failures that are really devastating, and population grows as a result. Life expectancy increases as a result. But there are going to be some disruptions because peasants living in villages where they were allowed to use the open field system, and they had a relationship with landlords that, wasn't necessarily always great, but was still looked at as kind of paternal, where a landlord would like take care of and provide for the peasants on his land, Now that starts to get broken a little bit. And peasants who aren't able to work on enclosed land, they get displaced. They might go to another town or village looking for work. And there's less of a sort of like, I guess you could say social relationship between people working the land and the people who own the land. And it's more of an economic and financial relationship instead. So, now number 3. What were the reasons for rapidly increasing population growth across Europe during the late 1700s? We've kind of talked about these already. So new crops being brought in. So even in like Russia and parts of Germany where they weren't necessarily using new agricultural technology, they were still doing things like farming potatoes and corn on a greater scale, which allowed more efficient use of land. So even in places where the agricultural revolution didn't happen in quite the same way, there's still going to be population growth. And the plague was gone. So the Black Death, the bubonic plague, was gone by the late 1600s, and new sort of understanding of how diseases spread because of the scientific revolution also allowed people to take more effective preventive measures. So, number 4, what were urban guilds? What were their traditional economic and social functions? What were the ways in which guilds were increasingly criticized and circumvented in the 17th and 18th centuries? So guilds were, starting in the Middle Ages, kind of like, you could say, trade and social associations among people who were all in the same trade, the same job. So in a town or a city in Western Europe especially, all of the bakers, all of the dyers, all of the tailors, all the weavers, all the blacksmiths, all the butchers, they would all organize with each other in order to regulate the entry of people into those professions, in order to make sure that there weren't too many people flooding that industry, which would lower prices. Yes. It's sort of an early version of a union. And guilds, though, they weren't quite the same as unions, because guilds were generally composed of people who had very, very high skill jobs. Like to be a butcher, or to be a carpenter or a blacksmith, a master of these professions, took a lot of skill and a lot of training as an apprentice to get to that level. So they weren't really like using their organization to bargain for better wages or conditions with an employer. Like they were the employers. They were the people who owned the products they were selling, who were producing goods. And as a result, in towns and cities, they had a lot of power, because they could set prices for their businesses, they could regulate the quality of services being provided. So they were an important part of life in towns and cities across Europe, and especially in the West. And they had a sort of like social function as well, because the way that people sort of derived their social identity, if they were in one of these guilds, was through the guild. And they were sort of mutual aid associations. So all of the blacksmiths, all of the bakers in town would know each other, they would support each other in times of need, and they sort of formed a sort of core social identity group for the people who were in them. So it was kind of a social thing too. Now, by the 17th and 18th centuries, though, governments at the national level are going to start looking for ways to kind of undercut the power of guilds. And capitalists, people who are, in the business of doing business, are going to start looking for ways around the guilds, because they are sort of restrictive in some ways. And even though guilds, quite often people in a guild might adopt a new technology when it becomes available, guilds were increasingly looked at as kind of holding the economies of Europe back from becoming more productive and more dynamic and producing more goods than they could under the guild system. So in like France under Louis XIV, you have guys like Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the finance minister, who tried to limit the power of guilds and basically tried to force guilds to like back off and allow more people into certain professions in order to lower the cost of goods in those industries and basically make it possible to just produce more and create more goods. So, and you start to see economists, guys like Adam Smith, starting to write a lot of criticism of guilds, basically saying that they're They're against the principles of economic freedom, that it's like an artificial restriction on like the natural productivity that humans want to engage in. And it's sort of limiting the ability of a country to really be as productive and wealthy as it could be. So, now one of the ways that capitalists, that businessmen started to get around the system was through cottage industries, the putting out system. So that goes into question number 5. So this was basically taking the labor of producing goods and literally putting it out from towns and cities where guilds were dominant into the countryside, into villages where peasants lived and could do some of the labor in the process of producing goods in their cottages, like literally in their cottages. And sometimes you would have merchants who would take like a raw piece of wool or cotton out to the countryside, out to a suburb essentially, and hand it off to peasant laborers in their homes. And then they would do the labor of, producing a textile, hand it back over to the merchant. They would get paid, and then the guild system would be undercut, and that good would be less cost than a good produced by a very powerful and skilled tradesman. Now, sometimes like the capitalist or merchant in question would also actually provide the materials, would provide machinery, like kind of simple human powered machines to put into people's homes to actually facilitate this process. But basically it was a way of just breaking the power of the guilds and getting more goods out into the market through that. And that led to partly what was known as the Industrious Revolution, number 6. So in England especially, before the Industrial Revolution, you have growing population, you have peasants who are looking for work and engaging in putting out labor, you have people getting around the guild system and allowing more goods to be produced at lower prices, you have division of labor occurring, where machinery will be introduced to sort of break down and make more efficient the steps in the process of producing things like shirts or other types of textiles. And that allows just more stuff to be made, costs to go down, and generally the standard of living will rise in England, in the Netherlands, in parts of France, even before industrialization, because of the implementation of these new ideas and methods and so on. Now, there is going to be a big divide that starts to occur, though. Northwestern Europe, so France, England, and Netherlands, they really start jumping out to a pretty big, they establish a pretty big gap compared to Eastern Europe and Southern Europe when it comes to overall amount of consumer goods that are available, the standard of living that is available to people in those countries. And to some extent that's built on the growing food supply and the more efficient food supply that allows more people to go into wage labor or other types of work and produce more types of goods. So, now number 7, what were the goals and attitudes behind mercantilist trade policies and the ways in which the British Navigation Acts and other specific mercantilist methods pursued these goals? So mercantilism, at its core, looks at all of the wealth in the world as fixed, that there's only so much that is out there, and trade is essentially a zero-sum game. If one country is selling something to another in a trade relationship, then they are winning, essentially. They're taking in wealth from the other country, and the other country is sending out wealth in the form of gold and silver. And mercantilists basically had a couple of goals. They wanted to make sure that their countries were the ones building up the biggest supply of gold and silver, which could then be used for other purposes, for investing in domestic industries, for building up their army or navy to increase their military power. So it wasn't just gold and silver for the sake of having a big stack of gold and silver. It was meant to be used for other political economic purposes to make their countries even more powerful. So now mercantilism then, a mercantilist also looked at colonies as essentially natural resource banks and captive markets, places where you could get materials and resources to produce more goods in your own country and then sell them or export them, and they looked at them as markets where you could export goods and essentially make sure that wealth was coming into your country rather than going out to another country. So, now the British Navigation Acts that were passed in the 1650s, actually when Oliver Cromwell was in charge of the country, these basically said that in order for goods to be imported into Britain, they had to be on ships that were owned by British companies, that were staffed by British sailors, and the same thing for British colonies. British colonies could only import goods from Britain, from British sailors, from British ships. And, the Navigation Acts were enforced to varying degrees over time. Sometimes they were seriously enforced, sometimes totally ignored, but it was intended to create a system where all of the resources of the colonies were going to Britain, and all of the domestic product of Britain was being sold to the colonies. So, now the Spanish, they also had a mercantilist system where their colonists in Peru, in Mexico, were only allowed to import finished goods from Spain. They weren't allowed to import goods from Britain or from France or from any other colonies, because basically the Spanish wanted to make sure that the silver and gold getting pulled out of the ground there was going to Spain, where the Spanish government could use it effectively to build up their army and navy and so on. Now, ultimately, the Spanish really kind of squandered all of the gold and silver that they were bringing in by the middle of the 1600s. But this attempt to kind of create a very closed circuit of trade was something that the Spanish relied on. But one other method of mercantilism is trying to build up domestic production in order to produce goods that you could then export to other countries for profit. So the Dutch, they were the ones who established control over spice plantations in Indonesia that gave them a monopoly on the production of certain spices and therefore all of the profit from it. They were also the ones who developed porcelain industries internally to replace Chinese imports, to basically make sure that they were the ones getting the profit from that particular good rather than sending out wealth to China to get their hands on that stuff. So, all right. So, number 8. What were the ways in which the outcomes of the Anglo-Dutch Wars, the War of the Spanish Succession, the War of the Austrian Succession, and the 7 Years' War affected the rivalry for global trade and colonial dominance between France and Britain? Who won this rivalry? That's a long question. But yeah, the shortest answer is that Britain won this rivalry. Because basically over the course of those wars, it was kind of a succession of successes for England and a succession of losses for their enemies in the global trade system. So the Anglo-Dutch Wars, that was in the 1660s and 70s. Basically, England went to war against the Netherlands, and as a result, they took over some Dutch colonies, like what eventually became New York, and reduced the Dutch presence overseas and increased the English presence overseas. So, the War of the Spanish Succession, that's where Louis XIV's grandson was going to inherit the throne of Spain, and basically the rest of Europe went to war against France to stop that from happening, or to limit its impact on international relations. And as a result of that war, France went deep into debt. England actually won the right to import slaves to Spanish colonies, which was an enormously profitable business that helped expand the amount of revenue that their country was generating. So unfortunately, there is a very dark side to the way in which the English got rich in the 1700s. What's that? The War of the Spanish Succession. Well, so Louis XIV's grandson was allowed to take the throne of Spain, but Louis XIV had to agree that the two kingdoms would never actually unite under the same monarch, even though basically because the families of the royal families of those countries were now related, it was possible that the same person down the road might inherit both countries, but basically they had to make a formal agreement that was never going to actually be allowed to happen. Yes. France. Yeah, France, basically the 1700s, starting with Louis XIV, and this war especially, basically it was just a downward spiral of debt, war, loss of colonies and resources, debt, war, loss of colonies, resources. That's basically the story of the 1700s for the French, until, of course, the Revolution happened. So, the War of the Austrian Succession, and then the 7 Years' War. Basically, the 7 Years' War especially became a really global war. That's really the more important one for sort of long-term outcomes here. So in the 1750s and 60s, France and Britain fought each other on the continent, but also in North America, in the Caribbean, in India. And basically, as a result of the 7 Years' War, France was stripped of pretty much all of its colonies in America except for Saint-Domingue, or Haiti, which was still a really profitable sugar colony, but they lost their fur trade in North America, and basically they just lost all of those potential resources and wealth generation. Now they lost their access to most of India, and Britain began to expand their presence in India instead. So basically that sort of vaulted Britain into a new sort of level of global trade. And this is really when global trade involving England really took off, and it expanded English access to cotton from overseas and sugar from overseas that allowed them to just make more and more and more money and build up capital that would eventually be poured into the industrial system in the late 17 and 1800s. So see how this is all connected? The 7 Years' War allows, industrialists to finance industrialization farther down the road. Vince? So the War of Austrian Succession, that was a war on the continent that was primarily between Prussia and Austria over control of some territory between them. And that war actually kind of cemented Prussia's dominance in German-speaking countries. Whereas Austria then started to kind of focus more on expanding to the east and to the south rather than into Germany. They were really sort of blocked out of Germany after that point. And the Holy Roman Empire still existed at this point, but was really kind of a dead letter. Like, it didn't really matter anymore. Austria basically tried to consolidate their empire to the east, so like Hungary and parts of Poland and Ukraine, rather than looking to the west, to Germany. All right. Let's see. So number 9, how did the Atlantic system of trade function? What was the triangular trade? What was the impact of this economic system on France, England, Spain, their respective colonies? So the triangular trade referred to this kind of, you could say, rough triangle between Europe, Africa, and the Americas, where the Americas became an important producer of raw materials and natural resources, which would get shipped out to Europe, or sometimes directly to Africa. And then in Europe, these things would be turned into manufactured goods, which would then be shipped back to the colonies and to Africa, to West Africa, where it would be exchanged for slaves, who would then be carried across the Middle Passage through the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas, where they would be sold to slave owners in the Caribbean, in Brazil, who would then turn those slaves into labor, into profit in the sugar trade and coffee business and so on. So the Atlantic system then, this triangular trade, it greatly increased the ability of France, England, and Spain to derive revenue from their colonies in America. And obviously England were the ones who kind of won this game in the end. But it also led to declining prices in things like sugar and coffee and rum and molasses and raw materials like timber and furs that allowed the price of manufactured goods and just those particular commodities like sugar and coffee to go down. So it allowed more consumption of these things back in Europe. And essentially this is one of the things that started contributing to the higher standard of living that emerged in places like France and England during the 1700s. Now, number 10, what were the causes and effects of the growth of the Atlantic slave trade? So the biggest cause is that as the Caribbean and as Brazil were devoted more and more to sugar cultivation and coffee cultivation, and in North America, in places like Georgia and the Carolinas, where they produced things like tobacco as well as cotton. These, like basically the growth of really labor intensive plantation systems led to the importation of more and more slaves into these areas to do that work. Now, also, though, the reason why African slaves were looked at more and more as the sorts of labor was simply because Native Americans mostly were dying off by that point, and just simply there weren't as many of them left in the places where this work was being done. Like by the 1700s in the Caribbean, there were basically no native Caribbean people left in existence. So, now the effect of this in West Africa, this had kind of a destabilizing effect because the kingdoms that really capitalized on exporting slaves to European merchants were able to take in new military technologies and new types of goods that raised the standard of living for elites in those societies, and also gave them the ability to overpower some of their rivals militarily. So in West Africa, it had kind of a destabilizing political and economic effect. And, of course, male population decline in some parts of West Africa. Now, in the Americas, though, this led to a situation where there was a growing number of people of African descent in the Caribbean, in Brazil, in British colonies in North America. And ultimately, it led to a situation where in places like Haiti, 95% of the population were either African slaves or free blacks or mixed race people, partly of African descent. So, and the effects as well economically, this allowed people who owned land in those colonies to derive a huge amount of profit from what they were doing, and once again led to more consumption of things like sugar and coffee back in Europe. So, number 11, what were the racial, cultural, religious, and social characteristics of the European colonial systems in America? In what ways did they reflect inequalities and hierarchies in Europe? And what ways were they different from Europe? So this kind of depended on where you were in the colonies. In places like the Spanish colonies, Spanish colonists from Europe never really constituted that big a chunk of the population in Spanish colonies, whether it was in the Caribbean or in Mexico or in South America. And as a result, you're going to see that the Spanish colonists who were there, they tried to kind of recreate the feudal system that had existed in Europe, where you have a small number of colonists who essentially get grants of land and mines and business from the Spanish crown and control of labor of Native Americans and African slaves in the colonies. So it gives like the white colonists in Spanish colonies a huge amount of economic and political power. So, and then you have this kind of like racial hierarchy underneath the white colonial elites. So you have mestizos, people who are mixed race, native and whites, who become a new sort of like, you could say like second elite class underneath white Europeans. And then you have a huge number of Native Americans in places like Mexico and Peru. And there is a sort of clear social hierarchy based on racial classification. Now, also, the religion of the Spanish colonies was Roman Catholic, and that was really kind of like a tool of control, using that established church as a way of demanding and commanding loyalty to the crown through devotion to the church as kind of a show of loyalty. Now, it's true that many Native Americans in Spanish colonies became very devout Catholics and took the religion very seriously, but it was also used as kind of a tool of governance and control, as well as a religion that, in which there was true belief. Now, in the British colonies in North America, there's a little difference there, because that's where you have more whole families who came over from Europe. You have more settlers who aren't interested in like recreating a feudal system, but in actually kind of like creating a new society. And you have a lot of like religious outcasts and refugees from Europe who end up in the British colonies. But in the southern colonies, places like Georgia and the Carolinas, and in British colonies in the Caribbean, that's where you have, a sort of planter elite, white Europeans who own huge amounts of land, who do kind of rule over those areas almost as like feudal lords. So, So in some colonies, like the northern colonies, you have more of a sort of fluid, egalitarian social system that emerges, whereas in like the plantation colonies, that's where you have more of like a feudal system. So, 12. To what extent did the English, Spanish, and Dutch find colonial success in Asia and the Pacific during the 18th century? What parts of Asia did they control, and how did this benefit them? Hmm? Oh. Oh. There we go. So, number 12. So, the English, during the 1700s, and especially after the Seven Years' War, they expanded their footprint in India, and that was a place that was producing spices, producing tea, producing cotton. So as the English expanded their foothold in India and their trade in India, that was an enormous revenue generator for English companies who were involved in that trade. The Spanish, they took tighter control of the Philippines and turned that into sugar plantation colonies and as like a big military and naval base. And the Netherlands took control over big chunks of what's now Indonesia in Southeast Asia, where they set up spice plantations and use that as an enormous revenue generator during the 17 and 1800s. So, yes,
So in India, they only did cotton, or what else?
cotton, tea, some spices too.
What about the Philippines?
The Philippines, those were sugar plantation colonies under the Spanish. So, all right. So let's move along to chapter 18 and get through some of this stuff quick. So, so as Europe is expanding internally in terms of population and economic growth and so on, number one, what changes occurred in marriage, family, and birth patterns in the course of the 18th century? What were the similarities and differences between Eastern and Western Europe? So, in Eastern Europe, marriage usually happened, between like 18 and 21. So relatively young marriages, and families were generally bigger, and there's more multi-generational households because the population in places like Russia were more tied to the land. They were still stuck in serfdom, and there was less reason to hold off on marriage because you knew, like, I'm going to be in this village or this town for my whole life, and I need people to help me work on the farm, so I'll get married and have some kids. So, pretty much. Now, in northwestern Europe, though, so once again, in the Netherlands, in France, in England, places where agricultural productivity was rising, the standard of living was rising, places where peasants weren't tied to the land and could move to find new economic opportunities, that's where you start to see people getting married a little bit later and starting to have fewer children as well.
What area?
Northwestern Europe. Northwestern Europe. So basically England, the Netherlands, and northern France. Um, so this is where you have people holding off on marriage. And in England, by the late 1700s, the average age of marriage is somewhere in the mid 20s. They're having significantly fewer children, partly because nutrition is getting better, the food supply is getting more stable, so infant mortality is declining. And even though population is rising quickly, it's based primarily on a lower death rate rather than a higher birth rate. So, but once again, there is a sort of divide between Eastern and Western Europe in this regard. Now, number two, what was life like for children? And how did common attitudes and practices about raising children change during the 18th century? So, as infant mortality declines, and as birth rates decline as a result, and as the standard of living for more people in northwestern Europe rises, you start to see more attention being given and more resources being put into child raising. And especially because of the Enlightenment, with its emphasis on education and making sure that a child's mind is shaped properly from the moment they're born, as a blank slate, tabula rasa, you start to see more emphasis, especially among the middle and upper classes, toward education and making sure that children, have every opportunity they can to be loved, to be exposed to ideas, to be exposed to educational opportunities in order to potentially, increase their economic opportunity later in life. So I wouldn't say that this means that parents loved their children more than they did in the past, but there's definitely more devotion of resources and energy toward raising children during the 18th century. So, number three, what were examples of the community controls that traditionally limited antisocial behavior and illegitimate births in European communities? So, community controls, this usually applies to like village life, places where the population was still relatively small and immobile, where people stayed in the village, everyone knew each other, and basically you had a lot of social pressure on people to get married, especially if, a woman became pregnant. There was a lot of social pressure for the couple involved to get married to make sure that, the children were raised in a stable household. So in some cases this meant like public humiliation, like charivari, and like small scale crime also was not punished with like execution or imprisonment. There's more public humiliation, things like stocks and pillories, where people would be shown like, listen, this is not acceptable behavior, and would be humiliated for it publicly in order to discourage it. But in towns and cities that were getting bigger, and once again, especially in northwestern Europe, as people living in rural areas became more mobile and started going to new places and living in bigger populations that were maybe not quite as personal and not as sort of cohesive as a community, community controls start to disappear, and you start to see the rate of illegitimate births rising in northwestern Europe as a result of this. So, let's see. So actually that kind of explains number 4. So let's jump to number 5. So common occupations for young men and women in Western Europe in the 18th century. So in towns and cities, young men might try to find an apprenticeship to, gain entry into one of the trade guilds. Or if they weren't able to find, skilled work or an apprenticeship, they might find some kind of unskilled manual labor instead. But it did become increasingly common. It's very dramatic music. All right, back to business. So, So, young men could become apprentices and potentially become masters of some trade. And once again, that's something that was primarily in towns and cities. So in the countryside, young men might work as farm laborers, or they might try to find work in some cottage labor as well in the putting out system. Women sometimes would do like cottage work in the house, but young women, especially in England, this became just sort of common. Young women would quite often leave home when they were in their early to mid-teens to become a domestic servant in another household in order to take in some money and try to establish themselves financially a little bit before the time when they might be expected to get married. So, now in towns and cities, unfortunately, women who ended up in big cities were sometimes, subject to exploitation if they became sort of vulnerable and poor. So some women, ended up working as prostitutes in European cities, basically because they couldn't really find employment in any other kind of gainful work. So, number 6. What were the causes and effects of increasing literacy rates in certain parts of Europe? So, number 1, literacy rates tended to rise in, well, where did literacy rates rise faster? In Catholic countries or Protestant countries? Protestant countries. Yeah, because of this kind of cultural emphasis in in Protestant countries on becoming literate for the purpose of reading the Bible. Now that became a kind of like feedback loop, where as people became more literate, they started reading things besides the Bible, which led to new, scientific inquiries and intellectual inquiries, and the places where literacy was rising, like England and the Netherlands, became centers of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, which led to the popularity of those ideas, which demanded more education and more literacy, so it became this kind of cycle. And in countries all across Europe, even in, relatively conservative monarchies like the Austrian Habsburgs or in Prussia, there was an increasing interest in those countries to create educational systems that were available to more of society. So even in places like Austria, in some cases you have the government actually putting resources into developing like public schools, not like totally universal yet, but available to more and more people. Now, as literacy rates rise, there's going to be more demand for books and printed material, and not just like high level books of philosophy. Like, not everyone in the middle class or lower class is going to be reading like John Locke or Voltaire, but novels and, books of travel and exotic adventures and stuff like that. But also, as former slaves in European colonies start to write about their experiences, people like Olaudah Equiano, slave narratives also become a really popular genre that feeds the growing sense of abolitionism in European colonies and in Europe itself. So, number 7, how and why were leisure, recreation, and dietary trends changing and staying the same during the 18th century? So basically, it's going to always be the case that poor people don't eat as wide a variety of food as rich people. But in some parts of Europe, you see poor people gaining more access to certain types of food that weren't necessarily there before. So peasants in Europe traditionally survived on vegetables, beans, and like a little meat once in a while, and bread and grains, so wheat. But wealthy people tended to have more access to meat of all types and spices that were imported and sugar. And increasingly, though, things like sugar and spices start to become more and more commonly available as the price goes down, as Europeans control more of the production and trade of those particular goods. Now, in leisure and recreation, you start to see, well, a lot of things kind of stay the same. So, especially in Catholic countries, religious festivals and saints' days were kind of the core of like the leisure and recreation calendar. Days when people would be allowed to go and play games, drink a little bit, and basically have like public revels out in the streets in their towns and cities. I hope that's not getting on the microphone. Yeah, number 7. So, and the kind of games people will play were things like blood sports, like bear baiting or cockfighting, but yeah, shin kicking, which not always a blood sport, but yeah, shin kicking, cheese rolling, mob football. But during the 1700s, though, you start to see more spectator sports emerging. And as the standard of living rises, that means that people in places like France and England have more money to spend to support spectator sports as well. So things like horse racing become more popular, and boxing matches become more popular. So, so there are going to be some changes happening there. But also new types of art forms emerge. So in the 1700s, classical music blows up, and theater and opera like totally blow up in the 1700s. And opera, governments started to subsidize and construct opera houses in their capitals, in major cities, to make spaces available for this new art form. And opera was a combination of music and dance and singing and crazy stories and bright colors and costumes and sets. So it was a sort of like multimedia extravaganza that there were operas for the educated upper classes, there were like popular operas for the lower classes, and that became a major art form that people consumed during this particular century. Now, 8, what was the consumer revolution? What caused it? How did Europe change as a result? So this kind of ties back to increasing global trade. This ties back to the industrious revolution in northwestern Europe, because in some parts of Europe, especially England, the Netherlands, and France, you see an increasing amount of availability of consumer goods and a higher standard of living. More people in society have access to money that will allow them to buy more consumer goods. So you start to see things like fashion becoming a thing that more people in society care about. Even among the middle class and like the lower middle class, the bourgeoisie, you start to see more focus on fashion, on buying new clothes, on having goods in your house. And the interiors of middle class bourgeois homes in England and the Netherlands and France became these like, just these like zoos of furniture and mirrors and candelabras and paintings and carpets and just stuff that was being produced in greater quantities that people wanted to have to kind of show, like, I've made it, I'm moving up in society. So basically, the consumer revolution, a combination of more production of goods, even before industrialization happens, lower cost of some goods, lower cost of food that allows people to just have more stuff. Now, once again, even in England in the early 1700s, most people were still poor. Most people were still peasant farmers. But an increasing number of people do sort of fit what you could call middle class and were able to really consume more consumer goods. So, number 9, how did greater interaction with the world outside of Europe affect European diets and consumption of goods? We've kind of talked about that already. So, increasing availability and lower price of things like sugar, coffee, spices. This allows people to produce more goods and consume more than ever before. Number 10, now once again though, Western Europe that's happening, Eastern Europe, elites only, even during this time period. Number 10, what was the role of religion in the state and in people's lives in the 18th century? So even after the Reformation, in European countries, even places that were Protestant, like Prussia or England or the Netherlands, you kind of have this situation where Protestant churches that had been supported by, powerful rulers during the Reformation kind of settle into their new role as established churches that are essentially part of the hierarchical power structure of those countries. So in Prussia, the Lutheran Church was essentially part of the Prussian state. And in England, the Anglican Church was part of the English state. So these established churches kind of took on the same role that the Catholic Church did in Catholic countries. And, increasingly you start to see that some people in much of Europe, even in Protestant countries, start to become kind of disillusioned again with these institutional established churches that are becoming wealthier, that are more sort of politically inclined. So, number 12, what changes occurred in Protestant and Catholic religious trends? In England, you see a new religious group, a new revival group called the Methodists, who essentially are like the Protestants of the Protestants. People who look at the Anglican Church or existing Calvinist churches and were like, you know what? We need to revitalize the Protestant religion, that we're part of. And in Catholic countries like France and Belgium, you see groups like the Jansenists who are trying to do the same thing in Catholic countries, kind of Jansenists or Jansenists, Jansen, who are trying to kind of revitalize and make the Catholic religion more of a sort of individual thing, with personal study of the Bible and personal preaching, and less of a sort of role for priests and the whole hierarchy of clergy. So, now religion though in people's lives, it was still an important institution that kind of set the rhythm of people's lives. So even in countries where the church, where the Catholic Church wasn't really dominant anymore, so places like England or the Netherlands or Prussia, people still went to church, and people still had the sacraments done for them by the clergy or by the pastors in their particular church. And even in Protestant countries where there weren't as many holidays or as many festival days, the religious calendar was still the way that people in some ways kind of divided up the year. So it was still an important part of just the rhythm of people's lives, even in areas that had turned away from the Catholic Church. Now, number 12, how did the practice of medicine evolve in the 18th century? What changes and continuities occurred in medical knowledge and practice? So by the end of the 18th century, basically there were some improvements in medicine based on the scientific revolution. So there was a better understanding of how diseases spread. And microscopes had allowed people to observe the first, germs, microorganisms that might cause disease. So there was a greater understanding of how to prevent epidemic disease, you know, how to quarantine people effectively. So medical practice did evolve a little bit, and the first inoculations occur in Europe. And smallpox, the first smallpox vaccines are invented in the 1700s that allow people to, prevent the onset of smallpox when they're adults. So some things do get better, but there's no anesthesia yet to make surgery, bearable. There's no antibacterials or antiseptics yet, so that's still in the future. So getting surgery is still a really dicey proposition. And anytime you would have to get cut open was a dangerous thing and would increase the possibility of infection and death. And there were still a lot of people in Europe who simply just went by old ways of doing medicine. So things like, the four humors theory that we talked about, and leeching and bloodletting as like a treatment. But generally speaking, it was getting slightly better, but not really that much better in the grand scheme of things. So that's it for chapter 18. Any questions so far? Leeching, where you put leeches on your skin to like suck blood out through your skin. Gross, right? All right. Yeah. So I think we'll actually stop there because for the French Revolution, all of the lectures for the French Revolution are already on the YouTube channel in the Chapter 19 playlist. You can go back and look at whichever one of those you want. So, have a nice life, everybody.